This is the OM-1 Mark II, the first flagship body from OM system cameras. And I have with me today the M.ZUIKO 150-600mm f5.0-6.3 lens, both released today. We are in Iceland because OM systems cameras are fantastic for exploring and adventuring. They're compact and we're going to see what we can get. The OM-1 Mark II is built around the same micro four thirds sensor that we've come to know and love in the OM systems cameras. Alongside that, they've improved their autofocus tracking, which is fantastic for wildlife and fantastic for sports, and they've increased the buffer available for Pro Capture, so you'll never miss a moment. It will capture images ahead of the point at which you press the shutter. We're in Thingvellir National Park. We're going to explore the scenery around here. But first, let's talk about the continuous shooting settings for this camera. It can shoot 12.5, 16.7, 50 or 120 frames per second. 50 is with continuous autofocus and metering, and 120 is with fixed focusing and fixed metering. The update for the OM-1 Mark II is those slower settings. OM systems have acknowledged the fact that higher frame rates add a lot of data onto your memory cards and adds a lot of work in editing, and if you know that you're shooting action that's slower, you can choose a lower rate and you've got less images to work through later on when you're back at home editing. The sensor in the OM-1 Mark II is a 20.4 megapixel backside illuminated stacked CMOS sensor. It's micro four thirds format, which means that it's smaller than both full frame and APS-C size sensors. It has a multiplication factor or a crop factor on lenses of 2 times. So if you're shooting with a 35mm lens, that will give you an equivalent focal length of 70mm. We're off on a whale watching tour, which is a great opportunity to test out the 150-600mm lens. It's perfect for wildlife, especially with the micro four thirds system, giving a 2 times equivalent focal length, which makes it a 35mm equivalent of 300 to 1200mm. So we've just got off the boat and we were so lucky. There was a lot of humpback whale activity. This lens was invaluable for that experience. It had all of the reach that I needed and the image stabilization that meant I could shoot those sequences of movement handheld. The tracking was really fast. It was really quick to lock on. And we also tried out some bird and aviation shots. So we had seagulls and cormorants flying overhead and in the sea around. So we tried some tracking images there as well. So let's dive into some of the specs. This lens has inbuilt image stabilization at the 150mm end, combined with a body that has image stabilization in the body as well. Then you have 7 stops of image stabilization at the 150mm end. As you use a longer focal length, that shows up more shake and more movement. But even at the 600mm end of this lens, it's got 6 stops of image stabilization. I was shooting handheld throughout that whole trip. I don't think I could have put a tripod up and got anything because of the movement of the boat, so I had to be holding it steady, and the image stabilization did a great job of keeping pace with me and with the subjects that I was focusing on. This lens is made up of 25 elements in 15 groups. It's got 4 Super ED lenses and 2 ED lenses. They have also included 6 HR and 1 HD element into the lens construction, so this delivers really sharp results throughout the zoom range. It's a real performer. This lens weighs in at 2,065 grams at just over 2 kilos. It's easy enough to hold in one hand. I was shooting handheld for 3 hours on the whale watching tour. The AF performance of this lens was really impressive. It locked on really fast and it responded very quickly to any changes in scene that I gave to it. That brings me on to the performance of the body in terms of AF. In the OM-1 Mark II, they've improved their subject tracking autofocus. That means that in their bird tracking mode, it stays locked on to the subject, even if other birds fly across the frame. And that helps you if you've got a frame, if you've got a composition, it means that nothing's going to distract that if it flies into the foreground. So that's really impressive. They've also added human AF to their tracking algorithm. And that means that it's not just looking for faces and locking onto faces, but it will detect a human body. So it's got all that AF functionality. It also has touch AF on the rear screen, so if you're not shooting through the viewfinder, you can touch and focus and touch and shoot just using that rear monitor. That's ideal if you are set up on a tripod with a particular composition and you don't need to have your face right up to the camera each time. And the next really important feature that this camera has, which the OM-1 series has had before but they've improved it, is Pro Capture. Pro Capture is recording and buffering images before you've pressed the shutter, so that if you press the shutter just after the moment, it means that it can bank those images that are in the buffer. It means you don't miss that moment. That was ideal for whale watching. My reflexes weren't quick enough to get that shot, but the camera was already recording those images. Pro Capture means that you've got that insurance that you can press the button and even if you're a little late, you can capture those shots. It's not just, one setting for Pro Capture. There's a lot of adaptability that you have. You've got 120 frames where you've got a fixed AF point. I was shooting at 50 frames per second because that gave me continuous autofocus and continuous metering. And that meant that for the movement of the boat, for the movement of myself and the movement of the whale itself, that focus could be tracked throughout. 50 frames a second and 120 frames a second can put a lot of files on your memory card. And in Pro Capture, they've given you the ability to limit the number of frames recorded in a burst. You can set it to only record 50 frames, and then you can balance how many of those frames are recorded from the pre-capture and how many are after you've held down the shutter. Or you can set it to unlimited, so then you can capture a set of pre-capture images and then an unlimited burst afterwards if you're really tracking something special. We're here at the Blue Lagoon. It's one of the iconic spots in Iceland. What I want to talk about is the computational photography available within the OM-1 Mark II. What that means is that it's an advanced image processing within the camera that's using composite image technology to do features that you would normally have to do in post-production when you get back, or it eliminates the need for additional accessories that you'd have to pack on. One of the new improvements from the OM-1 is that they've added an ND128 simulation in the camera, so that means that you can put on a 128 filter without having to actually put a filter in front of the lens, or with this lens here that has a domed front element, a filter might be really hard to use. So it gives you that opportunity that any lens that you put on, you can add an ND to that using those settings in the camera. What's new, so the OM-1 had NDs from 2 to 64. They've added 128 to that, but what is new is that they've used that technology to give you live graduated NDs in the camera. That means that you can bring in an ND to drop down the sky if you've got overexposed skies or if you've got overexposed snow in your scene. I think that these computational photography settings within the camera are a real benefit. It saves you from adding kit in the forms of accessories. It can save you a bit of money if you've invested in this camera. It opens up a lot of photographic techniques just by owning this camera that you would otherwise have to invest in more kit to facilitate those. Finally, the other kind of big hitter in computational photography is the pixel shift IBIS high resolution settings. 50 megapixel images can be rendered by this camera handheld. You can put your camera on a tripod and you can use that mode to deliver 80 megapixel images as well. So you get much higher resolution. Those raw files can be recorded in 14-bit, so you get even more image data that you can work with and pull out later in your raw process. If you're wondering how does that work, it's a 20 megapixel camera and it's creating a 50 megapixel or an 80 megapixel image. What it's doing is it's using the in-body image stabilization to pixel shift. It's taking those multiple images that is recorded really fast and they're stitching them together to give you more overall image detail. One of the things we've grown to love about OM system cameras and lenses is their macro performance. They have a fantastic range of macro lenses. This is the 90mm 3.5. Within the OM-1 Mark II, there are two macro specialist settings, that is focus stacking and focus bracketing. They can be applied to landscape as well, but we're going to talk about them in the macro context in a moment. Focus stacking gives you that stacked image that's been processed in the camera so that you can check whether you've got your subject sharp front to back. Whereas focus bracketing, you can check each individual image, but you can only see the final stacked image once you've processed it at home. So if you're getting more macro expertise, the bracketing is probably the way you want to go, and if you're getting better with your processing software afterwards. But if you want to take a first step into macro, then using the stacking setting can really give you that kind of immediate gratification of getting a really good focus stacked macro shot. After it's taken that sequence of shots, it will buffer for a little while it stacks and does that image processing. That's much faster on the OM-1 Mark II, and I haven't had any problem with it from shot to shot, allowing it to process and then moving on to taking the next image. You can shoot focus stacked images handheld, but you need a lot of light for that, especially for macro photography. So with the sun about to set, we're going to stick to a tripod for our macro examples today. The reason that you're able to shoot those macro images handheld when you've got great light is the IBIS in this camera body. It has an 8.5 stop IBIS. It means that, I've framed up shots with this lens and I've thought that I've been getting the image preview. It's held it so steady, which is insane.
Hi everyone, I'm George. I've actually been behind the camera for this review, but I wanted to jump in front of it just to tell you a little bit about the video capabilities of this camera. Most notably, it can shoot in 4K up to 60 frames a second or 60p. That's wonderful because you can get that 4K resolution and still retain the ability to shoot in slow-mo if you want to slow your footage down, but you can also shoot real-time as well if you want to. Now, additional to that, if you want to shoot even slower, you can go at full HD all the way up to 120 frames, so that's going to give you 4 times slow motion, which is really good if you want to add a bit of drama to your video. This is actually the first OM Systems camera that can record in 10-bit as well, so rather than 8-bit, which we're used to seeing, it can get 10-bit, which gives you so much more color depth. That'll give you way more flexibility to push your image when you're grading it, which is wonderful. You can also film in HLG, which is new to the camera, and of course you can also film in log, which you could do in previous ones, but we really like that if you want to retain that color control. Or you can film just in a normal sort of picture profile, picture look, just if you want those standard colors throughout your image and you don't have to do as much post-processing. Now, Johnny actually touched on this earlier, but they've improved the autofocus system, which they've also done for video. Most notably, they've added touch tracking, so that means you can just touch the back of the monitor and it will track your subject, which is really useful. It will do that for humans' faces and humans' bodies, which is the first time you've also had that in an OM Systems camera. So that's wonderful. That's actually a really good feature for video users. And when it comes to the amount of autofocus points you're going to get, it's 1,053 points across the whole of the frame, which is just wonderful. Now, that's it from the video because this is a photography first camera, so I don't think many filmmakers are going to be picking this up, but if you're a photographer and you want the ability to put it in video mode, it's got some good specs in there for you.
here at the Kerrid crater in Iceland. It's a volcanic crater lake. It's a little bit unsettling to actually be standing within the crater of a volcano, but it's also really awesome. I have never stood in anywhere like this before to take some great pictures. I've been using the OM-1 Mark II for a few days now in all sorts of weather and all sorts of conditions. We've taken pictures of lots of different types of things, and it's performed really well. Some features that I should definitely mention about the camera that we haven't been over yet: it's got 2 SD card slots, so you've got either the option of shooting with a backup, or you've got space for extra capacity if you know that you're going to be going for a long time and you won't be able to change cards or carry spare cards with you. The tactile controls have been great, and we've been shooting in gloves a lot. It's very cold here. Up at the edge it was really bracing cold, and I'm glad that in this crater we're quite sheltered from the wind. But even then, I'm glad I've got these gloves on and I can still use the controls really well. In terms of connectivity, you've got a USB-C port which you can use to read data off of the card. You can also use that for charging. It also, for the size and weight of this camera, they've had to use a mini HDMI connector. So if you are connecting HDMI, then it'll have to be a mini cable. You've got a microphone in and you've got headphones out, so you can monitor your audio as well as recording in from external microphones. Moving on to the other star of this trip, the M.ZUIKO 150-600mm lens has been fantastic. It's been with me every day of this trip. It's fitted easily into my Think Tank Speed Top 20 bag. It's given me the option to punch in to points in the distance where I've seen a composition and really get the most out of it without having to hike closer. So if you've got that kind of framing in your head, you'll know just how far you can see a composition and capture it with this lens. The option of shooting telephoto shots with the image stabilization both in this lens and in the camera body means that I can quickly shoot handheld scenes and get back into the warmth of the car and move on to the next scene. Sadly, that brings us to the end of our trip around Iceland with the OM Systems OM-1 Mark II and this fantastic telephoto 150-600mm lens. As part of a micro four thirds system, the OM-1 Mark II is really lightweight for the image quality and the features that it delivers. I've enjoyed carrying it around with me every day, seeing loads of different scenes. Unfortunately, that wraps up our trip around Iceland with the OM-1 Mark II, but I've had a fantastic time. I wish I could stay here. I wish I could hold on to this camera for a little bit longer. You can explore this island forever, and this camera will give you everything that you need to capture that. I've been Johnny from Wix. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.